This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The United Nations Security Council held an open debate this week on strengthening peace and security operations in Africa. Under China's presidency this month, the issue has been given renewed focus, particularly the effects of prolonged armed conflict and terrorism. The UN is now mobilizing the international community to assist the African Union and individual countries to boost their capacity to maintain peace. So what are some of the challenges facing peacekeepers in Africa? And what needs to be done to strengthen peace and security on the continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, China's support for the UN's peace and security mechanisms has increased over the years. Back in 2015, President Xi Jinping pledged to increase funding and the number of troops China was contributing to peacekeeping efforts, including an 8,000-strong standby force. Let's get a snapshot of the UN missions on the continent. My colleague Robert Nagila has more.
The first UN peacekeeping operation was in 1948 under the UN Truce Supervision Organization and UN Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan. At present, there are 14 peacekeeping operations deployed on 4 continents involving some 110,000 peacekeepers. China is the world's second largest financial contributor to peacekeeping operations, contributing about 10.5% of the total UN peacekeeping budget. This is in line with President Xi Jinping's pledge in 2015 to contribute $1 billion over 5 years. China has also trained 8,000 troops to serve as a permanent standby force for UN peacekeeping operations. In Africa, Beijing currently has peacekeepers in Mali, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. In February 2018, the 5th cadre of the Chinese peacekeeping force to Mali was recognized with the Peace Medal of Honor, the preeminent award given by the UN for contributions to peace since 2012. Beijing has also provided more peacekeeping troops than all of the other permanent members of the Security Council. Some 36,000 Chinese nationals have served in UN peacekeeping missions in the past 27 years. Back to you.
All right, thank you, Robert. And to help us unpack UN peacekeeping operations in Africa and under China's leadership, the UN Security Council's resolve to strengthen these efforts, I'm joined by a panel of experts. Professor Xu Xinduo, a senior fellow at the Pangol Institution, is in Beijing, joining us from there. And with me in studio is the Executive Director for the Center for Policy Analysis, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya. He's also Kenya's former ambassador to the African Union. And Mr. Meresa Desu, he's a senior researcher and training coordinator for peace operations and peace building at the Institute for Security Studies. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Beijing first, and Professor Xu, starting off with you there. This month, China is holding the presidency of the UN Security Council. It is focusing on Africa's peacekeeping capabilities. Why is this a priority, particularly the focus on Africa's peacekeeping?
Well, I think for China, you know, I would like to use the term like a special relationship between China and African countries and African continent here. You know, both sides are developing economies, countries, and both sides have suffered, the colonization or being semi-colonized in the past. And both sides are developing countries. Their priority is development. But in order for smooth development, you need peace and a stable environment. And I think China understands this very well. So that's part of the reason China is focusing on the security issue in the African continent. In particular here, peacekeeping missions in some of the African countries over there. And of course, China is making full use of this chairmanship as the UN Security Council, so to to decide the agenda, the items on the agenda of the discussions. So I'm not surprised to see this.
Right. You're talking about stability on the continent also as a focus. Let's talk about China's on commitments, though, in trying to strengthen peacekeeping in Africa. What exactly are we seeing in terms of changes?
Well, I think, as I said, China understands the stability, the importance of stability to a country's economic development. So I think it's 2 years ago in 2015 when Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a speech about China-Africa. He promised to donate basically 100 million to the AU to increase its capacity to build rapid reaction troops to maintain peace and stability. So China is basically understanding that an important role could be played by the African Union in maintaining peace and stability in this continent, in addition to, of course, UN peace cooperation operations here in the continent. And recently, in recent years, let's say, there's an increasing cooperation, so-called partnership between the UN peacekeeping mission and also regional partners like European Union and African Union here. So I think this is also part of that ongoing trend.
Right. Ambassador Mbaya and Marissa, let me get your views on assessing this move by China in November at the head of the UNSC. This gesture, what is your take on that gesture? Is it a welcome gesture on the continent?
Let me begin by talking about my earlier years in foreign service and interaction in the United Nations with the United Nations issues, particularly the United Nations Security Council. And I think we must commend China for taking up this particular mantle in terms of highlighting the issues on the African continent. First of all, Africa is a large continent. It is a very huge population, but still very less development in terms of comparison with the other continents. So I think that has generated a lot of conflicts, and it is just proper that the United Nations takes up these issues, because those are, I think, majority of the issues that actually get discussed at the United Nations Security Council.
Right. Marissa, your thoughts?
Thank you first. I think Africa is also affected by conflict, and the conflict is heavily devastating to the continent as well as to the rest of the world. And peace operations basically are the 50%, more than 50% of peace operations are in Africa. So focusing on Africa to support peace operation in Africa is an excellent gesture of China, and I think Africa welcomed it, because at this time also Africa are working hardly to reform the African Union so that to effectively respond to conflict.
Right.
So I think the debate was critically important for Africa.
I do want to come back to what Marissa here is talking about. 50% of the conflicts or UN peacekeepers are in Africa. Actually, it is 80% of UN's peacekeepers are on the continent. Looking at those statistics, though, Ambassador, because Africa hosts 7 of the 14 UN peacekeeping missions, and more than 80% of the UN's peacekeepers. In essence, Africa is home to the UN peacekeepers. Does this paint a gloomy picture of the continent?
I think it shows the concern the rest of the world has for Africa. One, if we don't deal with the conflicts on the African continent, we are never going to realize the economic development that we much are looking forward to. And if we don't have friends like China, like the European Union, who are actually supporting quite a lot of these efforts, it will be very difficult to address the issues that are the root causes of the conflicts on the African continent. So it is important that the rest of the world focuses on Africa to help it get out of the conflict situation all the time.
Professor Xu, that concern that the world is having in Africa is shown through that debate that was held under the presidency of China at the UN Security Council, though, and the idea is to mobilize the international community for investment and for investment in Africa's peace and security issues. Why is this important, though? Why do you think at this point?
Well, I think at this point, of course, we have been talking about not only the partnership, but also the capacity increase of regional organizations like African Union to play a more prominent role in maintaining peace and stability, in playing a role in peace operation, because usually the regional troops are more familiar with the situation. They can respond more quickly and more effectively. But at the same time, there's a need of support in terms of equipment, in terms of financial support. So I think for China, China is trying to make good use of this opportunity as the chairman of the UN Security Council to call on the international community to focus on the peacekeeping mission in Africa, the relationship between the UN peacekeeping operation and the African Union, its role in this region. So it's really about how much support and what support can the UN to provide to the African Union and also other regional organizations to play a more effective role, to have a better result, a better consequence in terms of peacekeeping in this region.
Talk us through African Union's role in better enhancing peacekeeping roles on the continent.
First of all, the African Union is fully aware of the problems that conflicts cause on African continent itself, because it is the continental organization, the regional organization, which has the mandate really to try and deal with these problems first hand before they even get to the United Nations. So it knows the problems. And if you take the example of DRC, for instance, it has been in conflict since independence, and it holds the largest UN contingent on the continent. And yet, there is no surety that the conflicts are going to come to an end in that particular country. So it is good for the AU to focus on it, and it is good for the AU to focus not just on DRC, but on other areas like the South Sudan and Central African Republic and so forth. The point we are trying to make is that you cannot achieve the objectives and goals of the AU 2050, unless you deal with these conflicts now. So this is part of a journey that the AU is taking to try and reach the goals that they have established and set for themselves.
You have mentioned the DRC, which is which has one of the longest running peacekeeping missions here, though, and one is going to be asking, are these peacekeeping missions, their mandate, what about the mandate? Are they still viable? Are they achieving the intended objectives? Or assess for us the point of some of these peacekeeping missions on the continent?
You see, peacekeeping depends on the mandate that the UN Security Council gives it. If it is simply to secure the peace, then it is simply going to supervise and see that there is no further conflict after resolution of that particular problem. But if it has a mandate to intervene using force, that's a different issue. On the other hand, using force does not mean you have to be partisan. So you still have to be very careful. The UN has to be very careful. AU has to be very careful on how the deployment is done, so that one party does not feel it is coming to fight for the other side. So it is important to have an all-inclusive understanding of the problem, and also the approach the international community is going to give it, I think, are critical.
Right. Professor Xu, China, though, is the largest troop contributing nation of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. What are China's concerns, though, when it comes to peacekeeping missions in Africa?
Well, for China, I think China, is actually playing a leading role in terms of the financial support to UN peacekeeping mission, and also its contribution in terms of troops and police force. For example, it's the largest number of troops in the UN peacekeeping mission. I think, just pick up on what have said by my colleague, in terms of the challenges from the Chinese perspective. Yes, there are some challenges, obviously, for the Chinese soldiers over there. Like the terrain is different, the weather is different. Remember, the area that requires peacekeeping often is poor, and with poor sanitation, there are possibly disease. There are possibly lack of equipment, like medical equipment, even medication, things like that. So there are a lot of challenges. But for China, I think it is a good platform for China to play its international responsibility as the second largest economy, and also one of the largest trading partner and investor in the African continent. I think China has a dual role to play, And also, as I said, China understands how important the stability is. China is also investing together with India, Brazil, the US, and other countries heavily in African continent. But if you don't have stability, in African continent, there's a great potential. This is the youngest continent in the world. But you need peace and stability. Give people the opportunity to develop themselves, to unleash the potential of this continent. I think China understands that. China, I think, is willing to play a major role, even bigger role in this continent.
I do want to get your thoughts on the protection of UN peacekeepers here, because we recently saw the loss of some Malawian and Tanzanian peacekeepers on the continent. How much protection do the peacekeepers have in Africa?
That question reminds me of Maji Rebellion, where they thought that by washing with water, the bullets would not kill them. That's not the case. So wearing the UN helmet alone is not protection enough. But I think the point is how much respect do the countries that the UN peacekeeping operations operate in respect, and do the people understand even the meaning of the peace operations themselves? So there's a question of education, there's a question of engagement at the local level, and there's a question of what the international community can do to bring these people together, those parties in conflict, so that they are able to deal with the problem of recognizing the need to have the UN forces who are neutral to help in resolving those issues. So helmet alone is not enough protection, but I think it is general understanding of the operation.
All right, gentlemen, do stay with us for the moment. We'll take a quick break now. The conversation continues on Talk Africa in a short while. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. My guests are still with me to analyze the UN's peacekeeping operations in Africa. Professor Xu, to you first, though, because we have talked at length, or you've mentioned prior to going to the break, you talked about funding for peacekeeping missions. African Union's peace operations are often constrained in terms of funding. Is there a sense from the international community, though, that Africa's peacekeeping operations are becoming a rather contentious or protracted issue?
The shortage of funding has been one of the major challenges, I would say, to this peacekeeping, regional peacekeeping, or the role played by the regional organizations. For example, there are some effective operations in Eastern Africa, but then, how sustainable that is. There is the issue of sustainability. You want to start the operation from the very beginning and finish it at the end in an orderly manner, and you need sustainable support financially, and also equipment, and also the other supplies to the peacekeepers. So yes, I think this is one of the very important issue, and I think China itself is doing in various actually means, I would say, in addition to the $100 million US, but also there are some China-Africa Security Foundation, basically, to support activities and capacity building in this area.
The issue of funding, Marissa, here, the African Union has called for access to the UN-assessed contributions to the fund for peacekeeping missions. But so far, the draft resolution is yet to be adopted. Why does it look like it is so difficult to come to a consensus on this issue?
The funding issue within the African Union and the contribution of member countries to the African Union, it is delayed, but also there is a progress. Since the establishment of the Peace Fund, countries, they contribute, but not all. But now I think the progress is they already established the board of trustees to manage that one. Again, the Kabruka proposal, that is the levy 0.2% of taxes, and that may sustain the need of finances for the AU. But it's not only the AU, like for example, to cover all this, the conflicts in Africa. The conflict in Africa is not African problem. This is also a global problem. So it is all countries, member countries of the United Nations, must contribute to this because the peace operation, as we said, is 50%, more than 50%, 60% is in Africa. So all countries must contribute on this.
Why is it difficult to get that consensus from delegates though, for Africa to access the UN-assessed contributions to fund peacekeeping missions? Why do you think?
I think it's a problem that has been running for a very long time, and developed countries are probably getting fatigued about helping resolve conflicts which are never resolved in the first place. So that's one. Number two, it is important for the rest of the world to deal with this problem because it cannot isolate Africa in terms of development. You cannot develop the continent unless there is peace. And you cannot uplift the well-being of the people on the continent unless there is peace. That's why there's a lot of migration from Africa into Europe, into the United States. Until you address the problems, the real causes of their poverty and lack of resources, it is going to be very difficult. It is difficult because it has been there for a very long time. Since our independence over 50 years ago, peacekeeping operations have been in Africa running, and yet we don't seem to resolve the issues lying behind it.
But Ismail Chegui, the African Union Peace and Security Commissioner, though, in his speech, he did mention about being overloaded with conditionalities when seeking funding for peacekeeping missions. What conditionalities would he be talking about, though?
You see, conditionalities means they are trying to avoid coming into the continent headlong. So either restricted budgets on their part, there are other areas in which they are focused. Europe and America are focused on now the situation in Latin America, for instance, or Eastern Europe and so forth. So they don't want to deal with problems that appear to be far-flung and leave their neighborhood into turmoil. So I think the focus has also shifted a little bit, but we must keep talking about how they can help Africa.
Marissa, the concern about transparency as well, is that a concern for the continent?
I think so. Yeah. That is also one thing. Another thing is also the issue of compliance. The AU also is required to have the compliance to human rights in the humanitarian law as well. Other thing is also, I think there are also issues. There are no mechanisms set so that the international community also support the financial issues. Like for example, the ACF, the Africa Standby Force, since establishment, this is on process. Even the Peace Fund, it has some sort of remain outstanding issues to complete. So it is the international communities, they are not clear at some certain points how they can contribute on that one as well.
Right. Professor Shu, let's broaden this a little bit, though, and look at the cooperation between the United Nations peace and security goals and the African Union. How can this be enhanced for better effectiveness?
Well, I think the cooperation, really means is about, the support the AU need, the African countries need from the UN, the peacekeeping mission. But if you look at the world, the general situation here, there is somehow decreased interest in peacekeeping support, in peacekeeping efforts from mostly developed countries. It's for some of the countries, they would like to deal with the issue through a unilateral, a bilateral, or regional approach, rather than through multilateral approach like peacekeeping missions. But here, it's like a trend. There's increasing cooperation between UN peacekeeping mission with the regional organization, including African Union in African continent, of course, because they have the different the strengths and advantages. For African Union and other regional organizations, they are more familiar. They are from here. They understand the situation politically, in terms of security, in terms of the terrain. So it's easier for them to operate such operation. But at the same time, their disadvantage, I would say the shortcoming is the lack of support financially, in terms of equipment, in terms of other resources. I think in that respect, the UN could help. So if there's a strengthened cooperation, I would say both sides will benefit. Ultimately, it's a regional country. The peoples in the region will benefit from that.
Right. Are you seeing that decreased interest in peacekeeping efforts on the continent, though?
I think most countries are beginning to be inward looking. They're looking at their own problems. America, for instance, for United States is, according to President Trump, is America first. Europe is also dealing with their own problems. Africa must deal with its own problems as well. But Africa doesn't have the resources. So we have to go out and invite our friends to come and help. The United Nations is probably the best organization because it gives a structure through which such assistance and funding can help Africa. It also has the primary mandate for international maintenance of international peace and security. So it is in the interest of the whole world for Africa to receive attention and to receive funding to try and address these problems.
And you talked earlier about the longevity of some of the missions on the continent. So as we wind up this conversation, how do you make a peacekeeping more effective?
I wish I had an answer, but I don't know. But I think we all have to have concerted effort to try and deal with the problems, deal with the causes of the problems that are afflicting Africa. Power struggle, democracy, governance, and all those issues. If we deal with those and everybody feels happy and justified in terms of living on the continent, you won't even have these migration treks towards Europe and the United States. So I think it is a matter of ourselves looking into our own problems and trying to find solutions to them.
Marissa.
I think to be peace operation effective, what I would say is there is the initiative that the Secretary General already initiated, that is Action for Peace. It has 5 elements, and one of the elements that I would like to mention here is the political solutions. So far, peace operations are more engaging with forces. The political commitment, the political engagement is not there. So peace operation to be effective, there must be led by wing of political solutions initiative. Right.
Professor Xu, you have the final word at the end of the month. What would you like to see in terms of China's long-term commitments to Africa's peace and security issues?
I hope at the end of the month, China will be successfully draw international attention to the issue of peacekeeping in operations in Africa, and will help support, successfully transfer some of the authority and also financial support to the African Union and other regional organizations to better and more effectively implement those missions in this region.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. Quite interesting debate here. And that's all we have time for this week on the program. Thank you all for your contributions to the conversation. In Beijing, Professor Xu Xinduo, Senior Fellow at the Pangol Institution. In studio, the Executive Director for the Center for Policy Analysis, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, and Marissa Desu, Senior Researcher and Training Coordinator for Peace Operations and Peace Building at the Institute for Security Studies. Now remember to follow the conversation online on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also find this and previous episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist and on the CGTN Africa website. Tune in again next week for more in-depth conversations with Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.